Welcome, everybody. Since a lot of you are new and have not come, this is part of First Presbyterian Church, and Harry Eberts over there is our pastor. Wave, Harry. And what these classes are, it's been a series of dismantling racism classes. And then we looked at a lot of history and institutions, and then we developed some action circles. And the Education Action Circle has had a number of speakers. And so we've asked Jeannie Oakes and Carmen Gonzalez to be with us today to tell us about the Improving Education New Mexico. And because of the vital importance of this study and stuff, we broadcast it very widely. And we're delighted that a number of you have come from other places. If you want to say where you're from, feel free to jump in and do so. Okay, can do that later too if you would like. So I think we'll get started now. Today, as I said, we have Jeannie Oakes with us and Carmen Gonzalez. And Jeannie is a senior fellow at the Learning Policy Institute and presidential professor emeritus in education equity at UCLA. And at UCLA, she founded their Institute for Democracy, Education, and Access, University of California's All-Campus Consortium on Research for Diversity, and Center X, UCLA's Urban Teacher Preparation Program. And her LPI work focuses on equity, community schools, teacher preparation, with special emphasis on New Mexico. And Carmen Gonzalez has been a longtime educator working in leadership roles in K through 12 and higher education. She retired as vice president for student success at both Santa Fe Community College and New Mexico State University, where she is vice president emerita. And while she was at those institutions, she was able to bring close to $30 million in grant funding to provide professional opportunities for K through 12 and educators. So we have two incredibly well-credentialed people here, and they will be talking about the study that they conducted and what they did and their results and how it affects all of us New Mexicans. Good.
So let me share my screen. Okay. Everybody okay with the screen? You can see the screen? Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we are delighted to be here. Carmen and I have talked about this study in a few settings, but the idea of being part of a series that's thinking hard about dismantling racism is such a good fit. And the fact that you guys are recognizing that the education system is a really key part of the systemic challenges that we face is great. So we'll talk for about 25 minutes maybe on a study that has just been fairly recently released last December. The goal of the study was to provide New Mexicans a research perspective on the state's education challenges, and it identifies evidence-based ways that state policy can help address those challenges. I mean, everybody in New Mexico has opinions about what's wrong and what could be done differently or should be done differently, but we brought a research perspective to it, and partly to inform the legislature in their ongoing work to improve the education system, and with the Lujan Grisham's administration real commitment to having education go to the next level in the state. So you won't be surprised to see systemic racism throughout what we're going to talk about. Although I have to say we don't name it as frequently as we probably could or should, but tried to make our report as accessible and inviting to a very diverse array of New Mexicans. So let me see. Okay, this is actually a picture of the cover that has the full list of authors. We actually studied policy here in New Mexico for 18 months, and as a project of the Learning Policy Institute. Learning Policy Institute is in Washington, D.C. and in Palo Alto, California. And because I live here, we have a special interest in, and because it's such a fascinating place, studying New Mexico. You may have heard of our LPI president, Linda Darling Hammond. She's been really leading President Biden's effort to really strengthen education in the US. And this latest proposal has lots of LPI recommendations in it from the president. So we're very proud of that. You know, Carmen joined the study because in New Mexico, it is so important that even though I've lived here for 7 years, I do not have the perspective or the insights or the connections that Carmen Gonzalez has. And so having another researcher with a real local perspective has been an amazing part of our process. So let me tell you a little bit about the study. We started out with a set of research questions. They're very broad. So let me share my screen. Okay. Everybody okay with the screen? You can see the screen? Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we are delighted to be here. Carmen and I have talked about this study in a few settings, but the idea of being part of a series that's thinking hard about dismantling racism is such a good fit. And the fact that you guys are recognizing that the education system is a really key part of the systemic challenges that we face is great. So we'll talk for about 25 minutes maybe on a study that has just been fairly recently released last December. The goal of the study was to provide New Mexicans a research perspective on the state's education challenges, and it identifies evidence-based ways that state policy can help address those challenges. Everybody in New Mexico has opinions about what's wrong and what could be done differently or should be done differently, but we brought a research perspective to it, and partly to inform the legislature in their ongoing work to improve the education system, and with the Lujan Grisham's administration real commitment to having education go to the next level in the state. So you won't be surprised to see systemic racism throughout what we're going to talk about. Although I have to say we don't name it as frequently as we probably could or should, but tried to make our report as accessible and inviting to a very diverse array of New Mexicans. So let me see. Okay, this is actually a picture of the cover that has the full list of authors. We actually studied policy here in New Mexico for 18 months, and as a project of the Learning Policy Institute. Learning Policy Institute is in Washington, D.C. and in Palo Alto, California. And because I live here, we have a special interest in, and because it's such a fascinating place, studying New Mexico. You may have heard of our LPI president, Linda Darling Hammond. She's been really leading President Biden's effort to really strengthen education in the US. And this latest proposal has lots of LPI recommendations in it from the president. So we're very proud of that. Carmen joined the study because in New Mexico, it is so important that even though I've lived here for 7 years, I do not have the perspective or the insights or the connections that Carmen Gonzalez has. And so having another researcher with a real local perspective has been an amazing part of our process. So let me tell you a little bit about the study. We started out with a set of research questions. They're very broad. But we thought when we answered them with evidence, we could really support New Mexicans to develop policies that could leverage really positive change throughout the system. And we don't need to tell you that New Mexico ranks at the bottom of all of the national rankings, not only about education, which it does, but also about the safety net and care for children, support for children. So this is really a place that can benefit enormously from using what we know about how to make systems effective and equitable. So, but we wanted to begin with what do New Mexicans value and what do they want from their education system? And then to document the key features of the system and where they fall short of what New Mexico would like to have, and then look at improvement strategies, both drawing from within the state and from the national evidence base to say what kind of improvements, what kind of policy changes could really lead and support significant improvement. So our methods, we use multi-methods. We did some traditional statistical number crunching of data from the public education system, public education department, and other places. We relied on existing scientific studies and case examples, but we also analyzed reform proposals from more than 15 New Mexico groups, analyzed all the LESC and LFC and PED publications, and then we did interviews with nearly 100 New Mexicans trying to tap into leaders and activists and professionals from many, many different perspectives to get a sense of what New Mexicans really care about and to build on local knowledge. So of course, we got clobbered, surprise, surprise, and none of you've probably heard of the pandemic, but it did come and interfere at a point in our study. And we decided that since we were about halfway through, that we would really alter our work to think both about how the education system here can recover from the pandemic and how the way it recovers could really pave the way for a much, a significantly better future for education in the state. So let me start by giving you, well, now why am I not? Whoops. Let me get back to where I was. Okay. Always happens, right?
Murphy's Law.
That the four big findings of the study, I mean, we like to talk about this, giving the findings first rather than keeping it like a Agatha Christie mystery where you wait and find it out at the end what we learned. And most of these things won't be surprising to any of you, is that New Mexico really is unique. And everyone says it is, but empirically, when you really look at New Mexico and compare it with other places, it has unique characteristics that really complicate the effort to improve education. And it requires more resources and capacity, especially as the state takes on seriously this notion of building an anti-racist, anti-colonial education system. And then the second finding is that across the country and in other places in the world, systems that have made significant improvement really focus on 5 key elements of their system. So it's a huge system, it's very complicated and cumbersome. You can think about 5 key dimensions of the system. We can make some progress, but we need to do this in a New Mexico way. That number 1 and number 2 really have to be integrated in a way that we can see these sort of universal characteristics of education systems and to do it in a New Mexico way. A third finding is that accountability, unlike the accountability we've had in the past, but if there's a supportive and shared accountability, it's a way to foster capacity and high quality school improvement. But again, it has to be done in a New Mexico way. And finally, this is not easy work. It doesn't happen sort of with random acts of education policymaking, or dare I say, even the legislature bringing, 100 bills and trying to get them passed, because there's not a long-term strategy or a vision that's guiding the specifics of what's being done. So let me try to turn my page. And okay, so what makes New Mexico so complicated? Well, first, I mean, it's the best and the most challenging of New Mexico. This is an amazingly diverse state, not only culturally and linguistically, but geographically. And even though the population is small, it is spread out over this huge geographic area. And that's wonderful. And it's an amazing place for young people to learn to thrive in an increasingly complex and diverse world. On the other hand, it really complicates education improvement because a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. And the state historically has left decisions to local school boards and local administrators with lots of autonomy and very little direction from the state historically. But having that kind of local control requires a lot of resources. It requires really knowledgeable school boards and educators, and in New Mexico, great relations with tribal partners, institutional stability, support for program implementation, and just a great deal of capacity to take advantage of the local decision-making and to tailor schools to what the local community needs. And for the past 20 years, and with the No Child Left Behind federal law, the state has become more and more involved in holding local schools accountable, but not so much in building the capacity to adapt state policy to local context. So we've had this little schism of the state collecting data and sort of naming and shaming schools that weren't meeting standards, which in New Mexico is nearly all of them, but not as much emphasis until very recently on trying to really build the knowledge and skills of people who are doing this work. And then a second consideration is that we have a very weak economy here. And the state, as we all know, have been unable and really unable to lift a large portion of children out of poverty. So the barriers to learning that poverty creates, they certainly can be mitigated. We can't think about poverty as saying, oh, well, you can't learn because you're poor. It's not true. With sufficient resources and supports, poor kids can learn. Poor New Mexican kids can learn, and they can learn very, very well. But we haven't, because our state revenue and income levels are low. The state has just not been able to provide sufficient resources, even though it spends most of its public money on education. And we could see that in the findings of the Martinez-Yazzie suit, where the court ruled that the state just failed to live up to its constitutional requirement of providing a uniform and sufficient education to all kids of the state, and that there are many groups of kids in the state who are at risk, at particular risk. We sort of challenge that at-risk category a bit, and because our argument is that New Mexico has to approach this with seeing diversity of languages and cultures and histories and geography as a real asset, not a problem. Diversity is a resource. It is not, and it doesn't, and we can't consider poverty as preventing learning. But we also have to recognize that students whose cultures and languages have been marginalized or who face barriers created by poverty are the norm in New Mexico. They're not exceptions. You know, in most states, they think of kids who are called at risk because they are living in deep poverty or they're from marginalized cultures or languages that have been subject to systemic racism as a subset of kids who might need special help, special programs, special interventions to help remedy and to lower the barriers they face because of it. It's not true in New Mexico. Only 23% of students are non-Hispanic whites. Almost half of New Mexico schools, more than 400 of them, have concentrated poverty. That means that 80% or greater number of students qualify for the federally subsidized meal programs. So we are a state that is made up of poor kids and kids who don't come from the dominant white culture that really usually sets the terms for education systems. So the system's got to figure out how to put these students at the center and build the state and local capacity to implement programs in ways that take advantage of diversity and reduce poverty barriers. And by capacity, we mean they need dollars, knowledge and expertise, support from the public education department for local flexibility, and really good data that can be used, not data just to name you as a winner or a loser in some sort of standardized test score contest, but rather data that can really be used to identify challenges and to suggest solutions. So these are the 5 areas that we looked at. These are the 5 areas that systems have really made improvement, have improved. And we took each one and said, well, first is meaningful learning goals, knowledgeable and skillful educators, supports that meet students' needs, high quality early learning, and adequate and equitable funding. In a way, it's kind of a no-brainer. But it is reassuring to know that there's a lot of empirical evidence that these things make a huge difference in the kind of outcomes that school systems get for their kids. So for each one of these in our report, we identified, well, what is the evidence base saying that this is really important? Given what we know about New Mexico, what should the goals for New Mexico be in each of these areas? What is the current status in this area? And as you can imagine, the gaps between New Mexico's status quo and what could and should be are great. But we also looked at the recent progress. The progress that's been made in the last 2 years by the legislature and the administration to really try to shift the education system in quite a different direction and toward these 5 key elements. And we give short-term steps, things that could be done right away, even in the middle of the pandemic, and longer-term steps. So Carmen now is going to share our findings and recommendations for each of these 5 elements. And Carmen, why don't you just tell me when you need to have the slide moved, and I will try my best to move it.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, first, the state must clearly articulate a set of specific goals for student learning that can build on the strengths of the state's diversity and confront the barriers that poverty brings. Next. So we need clear learning goals for New Mexico. Deeper learning refers to the understanding and use of complex content knowledge as it applies to new contexts and situations. Curriculum, instruction, and assessment focused on deeper learning seek to support students' development of skills, such as collaboration, communication, and creative problem solving. Those are all required by life in the 21st century. Research shows that giving students opportunity to focus on inquiry and complex problem solving improves academic performance, including on state tests and graduation rates. The positive academic effects hold for both high and low achievers. Emerging findings from brain science reveal that building on students' cultural context is fundamental to their learning as it enables brain connections and creates psychological safety in the classroom. Social emotional learning builds self-regulation, collaboration, problem solving, conflict resolution, perseverance, resilience, all essential in 21st century life. Also increases academic achievement, graduation rates, improved class behavior, ability to manage stress and depression, and feeling of belongingness. And there is a growing body of research that shows that career and technical education and more applied approaches to academic instruction are an integral part of students' larger secondary education and improves graduation rates and participation in post-secondary schooling. High schools become both academically rigorous as well as promoting healthy youth development. Next. Well, right now there is a critical shortage of teachers, and I don't believe the pandemic has helped any of this. So we can go to the next one. Our educator workforce, we need an evidence-based approach to strengthening New Mexico's educator workforce. It would utilize smart recruitment to boost teacher supply in critical content areas and locations to fill all positions with well-qualified teachers who understand the state's diverse cultures and languages. Achieve stable retention by providing strong preparation, support, and mentoring, as well as competitive compensation. It will foster greater effectiveness with stronger pre-service preparation and ongoing professional development. These elements are important to improving the educator workforce. Consider that in 2019, about 15% of New Mexico teachers left the teaching profession. I would make a bet that we had even more this past year with having to do the remote and the teaching. That was a lot on their plate. Anyway, that number is nearly double the most recent nationwide numbers. One of the senators, the legislature here in New Mexico, said that it's the new 3 R's. It could be recruit, retain, retrain, and retain. So recruit, retrain, and retain. Next. Supports that meet student needs. Every system that has improved provides additional support to meet their students' needs. In New Mexico, that support must include mitigating the learning barriers from poverty and builds on the students' prior cultural and linguistic backgrounds. Because the majority of New Mexico students come from families and/or from cultural and linguistic backgrounds that have historically been marginalized, these students can't be provided as add-ons or in special programs for the minority of students who need them. Almost half of New Mexico students are 80% plus poverty and students of color. Such supports must be the regular program in these schools. Next. So we'd like to see us enable all high poverty schools to become community schools with extended learning time. Community schools is an evidence-based approach to building additional supports into the regular program. Students facing barriers are placed at the center of the schools rather than being seen as kids with special needs who need special service. It's an approach that makes sense for all New Mexico high poverty schools. The approach is also appropriate to New Mexico's diversity. Community schools draw on diverse local assets as they build their programs. Community schools vary across communities with different demographics, cultures, and language backgrounds. And as this slide shows, fully implemented community schools make a positive impact on students' participation and outcomes. Plus, the cost benefit studies find savings up to $15 for every dollar spent on community schools. Next. High quality early learning. We really didn't do anything in this particular research study on early learning because the state has focused on that, and we do have a what's it called? Anyway, we've got a vote on passing the. They passed why can't I think of it?
The Early Childhood Trust.
Yes, so we have to vote on it in November to make it happen. And what that would do is that would give 60%, they'd take 1 or 2% of the permanent fund and they'd give 60% of it to early childhood and 40% to at-risk. Next. Adequate and equitable funding. Over the past 5 decades, the state has devoted a substantial share of its limited dollars to education. It has been recognized as having a funding formula that distributes funding more equally than many other states. That's all good. What's not so good is that overall spending has been low historically, and it is still not enough to meet the needs of students who face barriers from poverty and/or marginalization. Effective interventions and supports aren't inexpensive. And despite the state's focus on equity, New Mexico's low wealth districts actually spend less than high wealth districts. Unlike in Alaska, Minnesota, Utah, and Wyoming, where low wealth districts spend at least 30% more than the wealthiest districts, according to national data. Next. How can money matter? Well, recent studies demonstrate that where more money is spent on education for students from low-income families, achievement and graduation rates improve. Moreover, life outcomes also improve, such as employment, wages, and reduced poverty rates. Supportive accountability. Changes in these 5 areas, that's the next slide, I believe. Yes. Changes in these 5 areas must be accompanied by strategies for increasing districts' capacity to implement programs effectively in very diverse contexts, support professional growth, and allocate and use funding well. Our analysis that a supportive approach to accountability can help do that. For the past 2 decades, New Mexico's accountability policies followed the approach based on the theory that schools, teachers, and children would perform better if the state set specific test score improvement targets and administer a regime of sanctions on these who failed, ranging from public labeling to closing schools. The biggest problem was thought to be a lack of focus or effort rather than a lack of capacity. And because of that, we lost a lot of teachers as well. But high stakes testing without investing in or supporting improvement didn't work, not here or anywhere. New Mexico's reading and math scores stalled and some actually declined. The curriculum narrowed, much instruction turned into test prep, educators were demoralized, and the workforce was threatened by shortages. Enrollments in preparation programs declined. Evidence about supportive accountability. Research on effective accountability suggests a very different approach. Effective systems focus both on the performance of the system and on the conditions and opportunities underlying that performance that are the barriers to and or facilitators of improvement, including the inputs and processes that produce student learning. They do not presume that information about outcomes is sufficient for improvement. Effective systems have a mix of state directions, support, and oversight, and the local autonomy to align state and local goals and priorities, strengthen governance, and provide schools and districts the flexibility they need to serve their communities effectively. Next. The blueprint for Maryland's future. Well, how do we get there? Over the past 30 years, many states have successfully used high-profile commissions comprised of citizens, business leaders, educators, and policymakers to study and make recommendations for comprehensive reform of their education systems. Kentucky, Connecticut, New York, California, Idaho, Maryland, North Carolina, among many others, have done this. Most, but not all, were formed to help the states address court rulings, such as in the Yazzie Martinez case, that the state system is inequitable or inadequate, given the state's constitutional requirements for public education. So this is a photo of the commission release, the Maryland's commission release of their report. Go ahead, next one. So this is not a new idea in New Mexico. Most New Mexico stakeholders agree that a broad array of people should be involved in guiding education improvement. In the recent legislative session, as in the last 2 years prior, a bill was introduced that would create a commission on equity and excellence in education to address long-term strategies to improve New Mexico public schools. It was not acted upon. And part of the reason for a commission is that every time we have a change in administration, it's like whiplash for educators. Everything just changes. And so by having a commission that would span different administrations, I think it would make it better for continuity and knowing, planning, and as New Mexico recovers from the economic and educational setbacks from the pandemic. The full effects are unknown, and recovery is likely to be slow, and keeping a vision of long-term systems change is especially challenging during times of crisis. The next slide. There were a number of education bills passed, but these particular ones sort of relate to the study that we did. House Bill 2 and 3 is the General Appropriations Act. And actually, there was 5.5% more in funding for education for fiscal year 22. And House Bill 6 is the State Equalization Guarantee Distribution. And that is basically the impact aid, and it was the districts that don't have taxing authority, like a lot of the Pueblos and Native American places, and Los Alamos. Anyway, we used to get a lump sum of money from the federal government, and it would be divided up among all the districts. And this bill it's now going to be going to the districts that have the need for it. Grow Your Own Teachers Act scholarships. As we said earlier, we really do need to expand our teacher pool. And this bill would work with teachers who are like teacher aides, and then if they want to become a teacher, and they would even be given leave to continue their schooling. And the Bilingual and Multicultural Ed Advisory Council is to work with the PED on matters related to bilingual and multicultural education, which was a big piece of the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit. And the Family Income Index is a different way to look at at-risk students. And what they will do is they will partner, the public education department will partner with the tax department and figure out what schools, and this will be going to individual schools rather than to districts, which is a really different kind of thing. And it's a pilot project, so we'll see how it works over the next couple of years. And Senate Bill 40, K-5 Plus and Extended Learning, allows for these programs K-5 Plus adds 25 days to the school year. Doesn't have to be 25 consecutive days. It could be, you take some days off of Christmas break and different throughout the year. And same thing with extended learning. Extended learning extends the school year by 10 days. And this always gets signed very late. And so the school districts don't really have time to find out from their teachers if they're willing to, because if they do either of these programs, it has to be the entire school. And for example, in the Santa Fe district, we couldn't get teachers to commit to the K-5 Plus program, but they are committing to the extended learning. So that will change the calendar. And I think some of this, and it's just supposed to be for 1 year because we had these programs for last year, but because of the pandemic, none of the funding was used. So that is it.
Okay. Well, let me just add a couple of things that have to do more precisely with the systemic racism challenge that this state faces. I think there are a few other states, Washington State, few others that have the kind of tribal populations that we have, but with 23 pueblos and tribes that have sovereignty and do have the ability to use the Indian Education Act and the Indian Education federal support to provide some schools for kids who live on native land. But 90% of the kids, the native kids in New Mexico, go to regular public schools. And we have in law, in statute, and it's partly what drove the Yazzie Martinez, some legal requirements that the state really does need to collaborate with tribal governments and tribal leaders on how to best educate Native kids, whether they're in regular public schools that are overseen by the Department of Education or not. All of those kids are New Mexico kids and are the responsibility of the state. Well, even though we have some laws on the books saying there's got to be authentic collaboration and cooperation, is again one of those areas where we've had I don't know how much will there has been to actually engage authentically about the education of Native kids, or whether it's a lack of skill, but it has not happened in a way that anybody is satisfied with. And so here, the idea of it's not just having a seat at the table to decide how kids would be educated, but it's also thinking about cultural and linguistic preservation. How it is that the cultures and languages that kids bring with them, just as the science of learning tells us, need to be those are the assets on which kids develop new learning. And they're also cultural treasures that we can't, that we threaten to lose. And in fact, lots of talk about a whole generation of Native now parents who lost their indigenous languages. So there's this is a matter of sort of social and cultural justice, as well as trying to create conditions where kids can learn well. So we have to really think hard about that. And I think part of the reason why the commission idea didn't pass in New Mexico is that we've never been able to create the level of trust needed to say, yes, we'll entrust this group of people, this very diverse group of New Mexicans, to help lead us to a better way. That there's so much history of ill treatment and mistrust that it's very, very hard. But the challenge is really there. We still need to have a way to build coalitions among diverse New Mexicans to really think hard about what they want their education system to be and how to go about getting it. And as Carmen says, regardless of who's the governor, that this is a long-term strategy, and it's anti-racism is at its very heart. So let's stop here, and it would be great to spend the rest of the time listening to what you guys are thinking about. If you have questions, fine. If you just would like to make statements, that's fine too.
Do you want to stop sharing your screen?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. Questions, anyone? Did I see a hand? Judy.
Yes, I taught for 25 years in Santa Fe Public Schools, so I know what the old school looked like. But can you talk a little bit more about community schools and how they differ from schools that those of us that are my age may be more familiar with?
Sure. Well, community schools, as it turns out, is a very old idea. It was the concept was really pressed by John Dewey, who wanted to make schools as social centers, but then really enacted by Jane Addams and others in early settlement house communities of immigrants at the beginning of the 20th century. And the idea is that the concept has not changed much over the years, but there's been a huge growth in evidence about how effective these concepts can be when they're put in place. And it's first that the school is really co-constructed by the professionals and the community. So it's a set of relationships as well as a place. In fact, the place is often a little different because the schools, because they're so involved with their communities, slop over, and kids learn from adults who are not necessarily educators, but who are community members with knowledge, and kids learn in places that are not just inside classrooms. So it's a very it's a much larger sense of school as a place and relationships. But there are really 4 pillars that make up a community school. One is that they provide integrated social, health, and academic support. So families don't have to go looking elsewhere or go to separate agencies to get the supports that they and their children need, that the school is a real hub and a center for those kinds of supports. The second is they don't think about the regular school day as being enough, especially for kids who live in poverty or kids from families that historically have not known how to navigate education systems well, that you need to provide expanded and enriched opportunities to learn. And again, this engages community partners, nonprofits, local businesses in helping to provide experiences and working with the kids. The third is that there's a very different kind of family and community engagement, so that the schools deliberately think about ways families can be involved that helps empower families, as well as assisting kids do better, knowing that parental poverty and instability is a huge factor in why kids have trouble at school. So they may have immigration services available for families at the school, or ESL classes available for families at the school, or some relationship with housing departments to think about housing stability and remedying homelessness and things like that. And then the fourth one is the idea that it's collaboratively led. And it's very important that schools and their partners, the partners and the community, don't come in merely as helpers, but they come in as co-constructors and as real partners in creating a vibrant and wonderful school that's the center of the community. And that's the ideal, of course. We have a wonderful community schools initiative in New Mexico. We have about, I think there may be a total of about 65 or 70 schools that call themselves community schools. About 30 of them are funded through state's grants program, and the legislature is very, very supportive and continues to fund that community schools program. So I could go on about community schools forever, but that's probably way more than you wanted to know.
No, that's great. Thank you.
When we were doing the research, we actually found a book about community schools in New Mexico, in rural New Mexico in like the 40s. So it's been around for a long time.
Nambe, I think.
Yes, Nambe.
Other questions? Sue? And okay, Mary
Yes,
next after
are there
Sue.
community schools in the Santa Fe area?
There are 2 different kinds of community schools, and we're working very hard with both the state and the district and with community members to embrace this kind of hybrid approach that's happened in Santa Fe. That there's a nonprofit called Communities in Schools that is the lead partner in several schools, and they do a combination of things. One is they provide services and support to the school as a whole, so things that all kids can benefit from. But then they also do case management for kids who are identified as being most in need. This is in the range of social support, academic support, health supports, and they target those kids. But the Communities in Schools is all privately, well, they have a contract with the school district for a small amount of their funds, but they also raise money from philanthropy, so they can pay for things that public systems can't pay for.
Right.
Like if a family is desperate and needs a rent check, or if a family needs a bag of groceries or something like that, they can do that because they have private money. The other form in Santa Fe is one that's a more comprehensive approach and really focuses on this relationship between the school and the community. And I think if you heard Lois Rednick talk, she may have talked some about that. And it is really, those 2 models have been thought of to be in competition, but we're trying very hard to help people see that the core elements are very much the same in both of those approaches. They're both the same approach. They're just done, they're not cookie cutters of each other. So there are, I don't know how many, about 7 or 8 I mean, there are lots of, unfortunately, when Santa Fe went to K-8 schools, it named as K-8 schools, community schools.
Right.
So there are a
They're
lot
not.
of schools that have signs on the door that say we're a community school that don't follow this approach.
No. They're not. There are 10 communities in schools, and there are 2 community schools, the other model. And I think the school district is putting in 2 more applications for next year. So
Okay,
there would be
thank you.
14 schools that would be.
So it's a mixed approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the essence is the same everywhere, but the way particular schools decide to create those, I mean, we call them the 4 pillars, it can be different, and it depends on sort of what assets are in the communities and what needs are there and the availability of partners. And so the state has so far been really good about trying to say, you know, we'll fund community schools if they have the 4 pillars, and we're not going to prefer one specific type over the other.
Right. But it's the responsibility of the individual school administration to seek these out.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
In our
Thank you.
report, we argue that over time, the next 5 to 10 years, the state ought to make these schools more of an entitlement for all of these high poverty schools. So it really is thought of as the norm especially in communities of concentrated poverty, but we're not there yet. We're now still with competitive grants.
Right. Transitional. Thank you.
Mary?
Mary's muted.
She's trying.
I couldn't find my unmute button. I was confused about one thing that you spoke about, and I may have misunderstood what you said. It was that you could not get teachers' concurrence to, it was an after, or I guess an extended learning period. And so my question is, if a teacher, you know, signs a contract that they're going to teach for a year, does that contract come with kind of just parameters that are already set, that these are your hours or this is what you're signing up for? And so the districts are asking teachers to do more than they actually signed their contract for? Is that why the teachers had an option of saying yes or no?
Well, it is, it's not part of their contract, so it would be separate from their contract. They would get, if they participate in the extended learning program, they get a 6% increase in their salary. If they participate in the K-5, which is 25 extra days, they get 14% increase in their salary. Now, the problem with what I said was that teachers were reluctant. I think if we knew a whole year ahead of time, but by the time the governor signs the budget just a couple of weeks ago, and we have to turn in, school districts have to turn in their budgets, it's kind of a tight turnaround to get teachers to commit. They've already have plans for the summer. So if we could do this like a year ahead of time and really plan. And the other thing that's been talked about, you know, we still are on an agricultural model of education, and I'm not quite sure why, but they have been talking for the past few years of just every year adding 5 days, then 10 days, then 15 days, you know, to the calendar, the school calendar. So eventually we would be going more year round. I mean, there'd be vacations within the school district. I taught at a school in Albuquerque that was year round. It didn't have any more days than 185. It just was spread out throughout the year, and students lost less. There was less learning loss with that kind of model.
I bet. Okay, that makes more sense. I didn't understand what the issue was. I mean, I'm thinking, you know, like from a corporate standpoint, you know, you want a job, this is what you do. So now it makes way more sense to me. I mean, it's like, nobody ever asked, like, are you willing to do this? I mean, that was not even a part of the equation. So just, thank you.
Teresa?
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in on that topic. I'm a school board member down in Las Cruces, and we had just recently passed our calendar. And in the last couple of years, it's become a very contentious issue. So they were trying to extend the calendar year in 2020. And I don't know why we brought it up in, I believe, January. I had just started. The community itself, it wasn't even the teachers, were against it. And when we surveyed again for the calendar options for this year, the balanced school year that you're referencing, Ms. Gonzalez, with going year round with, breaks all the way around. I don't think a lot of people are familiar with it. It hasn't been discussed enough to understand the merits of it. So it got like 13% interest. But the majority of our community, and we have a very vocal parent, representation or participation, they were against it. I think the teachers in our district, like teachers across the state, have a tendency to feel like they don't have a choice. They thought, well, if you're only allowed, do we have a choice between 25 days or 10 days? And the parents said, we want the option of no days, right? No extra days. So that kind of really killed the conversation as far as what would benefit would come from 25 days or 10 days. There was no discussion. I don't think we had any idea of what programs could be implemented in that time. And I just came from a meeting this morning with Deputy Secretary Warnament, because one of my representatives said, I would like for you to talk with the PED and kind of see where the flexibility is with the funding. Now, unfortunately, SB 40 kind of kills that flexibility. When it mandates,
mandated. It's not
yeah.
mandated. They took that out. It was originally mandated.
But it does still require every student to participate in every school.
Yeah. If you get into the program.
So I will, yes, I will. Yeah, so let's not use the word mandate, but by requiring every student in every school to participate, there was some retaliation from our family saying, well, I don't think my kid needs that. And what are they going to do differently than what they're already doing during the school day? Yeah. And if we don't, whoever was supposed to be kind of marketing that idea, there were no ideas attached to it. There was no programs to really help families understand how, not just like, oh, extra time, because really that's onus on the teacher, the same teacher for all that time, when we could be bringing in additional tutors or support staff to take that off the teacher. So for us, it was the parents and not, and also, yes, teachers as well, but it was pretty representative across the board.
We had parents not want to participate as well. And
we have a whole generation of parents who went to school under No Child Left Behind and have an image of school as a lot of drill and practice and preparation for standardized tests in language arts and math. And so we don't carry around with us images of what really progressive, wonderful, whole child schools could be like. The kind of schools we envision are places where kids and families would want to be, but we're not there culturally. We just we've not explored the possibilities. We've encouraged the state, and there's some interest in it, and maybe more in the PED maybe than the legislature, of really thinking about bundling these expanded learning time programs in K-5+ with programs with support for community schools, or with support for Indian education initiatives, or so there's a way of using that time, which is so precious and important, but using it in a very enriching and constructive way. But we're not there yet.
I was going to tell you that when I was at the year-round school, one of the reasons why we had to stop doing it was because of athletics, because not every school in the state was on a year-round schedule. So they couldn't participate in athletics, so we had to stop it. But the students did really well and their test scores improved and everything. But, you know, there's some other things that drive education.
Yes. Okay. We're sort of out of time here, but I have one question to ask before we go. And that is, how can any of us as individuals or organization like the church help in any of this? Is there anything that we can do to help improve education in New Mexico?
Well, I think both the PED and the legislature are quite pleased and interested when people pay attention to what policies they're thinking about and make some suggestions about how the state could better sort of serve and build the capacity of local schools and districts. Unfortunately, we don't yet. We were hoping that this commission would provide kind of a place where stakeholders from all parts of the state could get together and really think hard and contribute ideas. We don't have that yet. So there's some sense that, well, maybe we have to build that kind of a coalition ground up. So you guys might be interested in thinking about, if that were to happen, how you might contribute to that, or yeah.
Okay. Because a number of people here are part of the Interfaith Coalition on Public Education. So that would be a place to do that too.
Absolutely. And they do such an outstanding job of really paying attention and really trying to speak on behalf of marginalized kids who are so used to school systems, where we've got lots of active vocal parents and community members who are speaking on behalf of the advantaged kids, that the Interfaith Coalition here is a really wonderful voice to have.
Okay, yeah. Well, thank you, Jeannie and Carmen. We really appreciate this. It was great to hear all of this. And we would like to support you all in your efforts as best we can, and we'll try to figure out how to do that some. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.